Thanks, Freya, and thank you very much, Cosmin and Freya, for the invitation. It's a real honour to be here to celebrate 20 years of Parasite, and congratulations too on the exhibition this morning. It was wonderful. I'll also range across several decades. Of course, a decade's not the best way to mark events, but it's a useful gathering point. And the 2000s I see as a kind of midpoint between, obviously, the discussions over these 3 days, but very much informed by what goes before and what comes after. Globalisation was a buzzword in the 2000s, and sprawling biennials studded with artists from around the world were the ideal platform to represent and explore its wide-ranging operations and effects. It's perhaps still a little close to call, but it appears from this vantage point to be a time of consolidation, with biennials moving from being local iterations of international developments into being more integrated and outward-facing, forming a thickening circuit of events that involved a highly mobile class of curators, artists, and increasingly collectors and dealers. In tandem with the ballooning world economy through the 2000s and its emergent hubs in China, India, and the Middle East, the expansion of the art market was a crucial force during this decade. And the art fair came to be not only a venue for trade, but increasingly a platform for curatorial and discursive activity as well, mimicking, if not rivaling, biennials in scale and scope. And Uta mentioned the growth of those art fairs in Europe during the 90s, such as ARCO, and in the 2000s they expanded to Asia, helping to form new centres in cities such as Dubai and here in Hong Kong. In Europe, Documenta 11 in 2002, curated by Okui and Wezor, brought a focus on globalisation viewed through a post-colonial lens. Its premise was that the world could no longer be considered at a distance. We're now living in a world of proximities, of nearness, not an elsewhere, where diverse temporalities and subjectivities are operating simultaneously. The exhibition in Kassel and its series of deterritorialised platforms around the world attempted to grapple with the great global forces at play at the turn of the century: mass migration, terrorism, war and economic inequality, as well as making visible forms of daily life in diverse locations that had until then escaped representation in such arenas. Documentary film, photography and room-scale installations were the predominant modes of art presented, as in the Yinka Shonibari work here, pointing to the pervasiveness of digital media as the means of distributing and receiving information, as well as the increasingly immersive and interactive nature of spectatorship. Fluid temporalities were explored through long-form video and film, and as well as durational performances with Onkawara's 1 Million Years, the sheer length and volume of time-based work making it impossible for the viewer to take in everything. A deliberate curatorial strategy that echoed our daily sense of information overload. Documenta 11 has been highly influential, but was itself informed by the new forms of exhibition making that emerged during the late 80s and 90s. Pioneering exhibitions such as the Third Havana Biennial, Magicien de la Terre, and Rashid Arin's The Other Story, all 1989, attempted, as Charles Escher has written, to deal with the question of how to realise an internationalist vision of art in terms that were shaped and understood locally. The emergence of biennials in cities such as Istanbul, Gwangju, Dakar, Busan, Sharjah, Fukuoka, Shanghai, Brisbane, Makassar and Johannesburg, including in Wezor's own 1997 edition, provided platforms for a range of ideas and practices that drew on diverse traditions and social conditions. This proliferation indicated the enormous structural changes taking place around the world in terms of a rapidly shifting, expanding and interconnecting global economy, supported by new communications technology and cheaper and easier movement of people, such as cheap flights. The art historian John Clark has traced the connections between globalisation and the Asian art world, noting the impact since the 90s of the penetrability of the nation-state to new electronic media, access to international languages such as English, or the dispersed facility to translate from them, as well as increased mobility of artists between non-national cultural centres. Furthermore, the postmodern and post-colonial questioning of received modernist narratives of progress and of Europe and America as the central points of origin opened up the potential for resistance to those narratives and a recognition and exploration of multiple local histories of modernity. It was not an entirely new phenomenon. The Cold War period also saw the establishment of numerous events, such as the Biennale du Méditerranée in Alexandria in 1955, supported by NASA, to the Triennale India in 1968, to the Biennial of Sydney in 1973, which launched the Sydney Opera House and initially had a Pacific Rim focus, to Dhaka's Biennale of Asian Art in 1981. These exhibitions were largely characterised by regionalism, often to commemorate independence or to form intercultural blocs, to challenge colonial or Cold War national formations. My talk today will consider two recurrent exhibitions in our region, the Asia Pacific Triennial, or APT in Brisbane, and the Singapore Biennale, both exhibitions that I've been involved with, and how they reflected the shifting interplay between the local, the regional, and the global during the 2000s. Both exhibitions were attempts to create a connection to the world via a form of regionalism, in countries that have remarkably similar anxieties about where they might fit. Their regional constructions, the Asia Pacific in Brisbane's case, and Southeast Asia for Singapore, correspond to economic and diplomatic frameworks, yet are also bound by a desire for cultural belonging for these migrant nations, in zones where they sit both inside and outside. Australia is a largely European country between Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, and Singapore is a largely Chinese city-state in a Malay archipelago. Oh, sorry, forgot my images. The APT was already established by the 2000s, having had its first edition in 1993, while the Singapore Biennale was inaugurated in 2006, after a series of lead-up events in previous years. The fourth triennial in 2002 marked a significant shift in the project's approach and format from its three 1990s editions, while the first Singapore Biennale established a new, globally oriented exhibition in a city that rarely exhibits art from outside Southeast Asia. Both editions closely followed announcements of a major new art museum for their city, the Gallery of Modern Art, or GOMA, and the National Gallery Singapore. It was the decade of the museum boom, augured by Europe by the Guggenheim Bilbao opening in 1997 and Tate Modern's launch in 2000, while in Asia, China's State Administration of Cultural Heritage declared in 2002 that the country would construct 1,000 museums by 2015. And by 2013, it already built almost 1,500. M+ was announced in 2005, and the Saadiyat Cultural District development in Abu Dhabi was announced in 2006, amongst others. The APT, organised by the Queensland Art Gallery, was initiated in 1990, with the inaugural edition opening in 1993. And it was established to create a new focus for this state museum, which was smaller, younger, and with a minor collection in comparison to its interstate counterparts, and in need of a distinctive direction. It came about for a number of reasons, including a confluence of personalities, a young dynamic director and curatorial team, a chair with a passion for Japanese art, and a progressive state premier. Queensland was re-engaging with the world after a 20-year period of authoritarian conservative state government. It hosted a World Expo in 1988 and the first Australian exhibition of contemporary Japanese art in 1989, which was supported by the then boom in Queensland in Japanese investment and tourism and the activation of sister city relationships. On a broader scale, the 1980s and 90s in Australia saw economic, demographic and cultural shifts towards Asia, accompanied by a significant reassessment of the country's identity and place in the world. Aboriginal art and culture was gaining an unprecedented level of visibility, and postmodern debates were widely embraced in the artistic and academic spheres, which included a challenge to the perception of Australia as a British outpost and the recognition of its status as post-colonial and multicultural. Engagement with Asia was being driven at a national level, with Prime Ministers Hawke and Keating stating that our future was in Asia. It was instrumental in establishing APEC in 1989, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, as a framework for closer economic integration, and developing cultural policies to support this direction, which included significant funding for exchange and exhibition programs. Varied initiatives during this time included the Artist and Regional Exchange, or ARX, which was a grassroots exhibition in Perth that included artists from Australia and New Zealand, and then Southeast Asia from 1987. The Asia Link program, founded in 1990, which focused on touring exhibitions and residencies in Asia, and Art Asia Pacific magazine, which was launched initially as an offshoot of Art in Australia in 1993. The establishment of a regular museum exhibition that looked at contemporary rather than classical art of Asia and the Pacific, which was Australia's neighbourhood and the source of a growing component of its migrant population, was seen to be a risky step at the time, and was first intended to be a three-part project. These three editions through the 90s engaged artists and curators from across the region, which for APT1 was constructed from countries that were the nearest to Australia in East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including New Zealand and Papua New Guinea. By APT2, this region had extended to South Asia, and by APT6 in 2009, it had expanded as far as Turkey. The exhibitions were developed by a co-curatorial model involving both gallery curators and external advisors from across the region, although the final selection was decided by the institution, which caused some consternation in some quarters. The region, as presented in the exhibition, was originally arranged along national lines. However, this model was quickly abandoned for a more integrated approach, although the catalogues retained chapters on each country and organised the artists by nationality, performing an educative function of introducing what were then new art histories to local audiences. Extensive public programs were a feature of the exhibitions, including not only performances and artist talks, but large conferences, which brought together a number of critics, historians, curators and artists from the region together, often for the first time, given the lack then of other regional platforms, which gave rise to a number of enduring relationships. The early exhibitions were characterised as a dissonant mass of artworks, combining vastly diverse practices, from site-specific installations using cheap or found materials, to works using traditional craft methods, to video and photography. They reflected the largely localised nature of much of the work being made at the time, when even artists such as Saigwa Chang and Takashi Murakami were not yet widely known internationally. The market had not yet encouraged the production of more polished, large-scale and elaborate works in many locations, and the gallery had begun acquiring works from the outset, building extensive collections of contemporary Asian and Pacific art when it was still possible to afford with small museum budgets and modest private funding. By 2002, however, a lot had changed. Numerous regional biennales had emerged or expanded around the region, creating many more opportunities for Asian artists to exhibit and for the art world to come together. Fukuoka's Modest Asian Art Show, which had been held every 5 years, became a triennial in 1999. The Taipei Biennale, as Amy mentioned yesterday, became international in 1998, and Shanghai in 2000, with Hu Han Ru's edition. Yokohama was launched in 2001, and so on. The internet made information, of course, more readily available. And in Australia, the cultural landscape had shifted markedly. The Conservative government of John Howard was elected in 1996, which promised a revival of relationships with the US and Europe and downplayed the emphasis on Asia. The right-wing politician, Pauline Hanson, soon after warned of the country being swamped by Asians through its immigration program, which opened up a populist backlash against multiculturalism, which was publicly supported to some extent by the government, which at the same time was quietly ushering in Asian immigration at record levels. Anxiety about Islam was stoked post-September 11, led by a hard line on South Asian asylum seekers arriving by boat. And manipulated by politicians and the media, refugees became conflated with national security and turned into a central issue in the 2001 federal election. On the arts funding side, support for Asian cultural exchange fell dramatically. For example, the percentage of federal funding for international performing arts exchanges in Asia dropped from 50% of the budget in 1992 to 10% in 2011. Within this tightened and more anxious social environment, with less political and financial ballast for Asian engagement, the triennial was reassessing its structure. While such an exhibition was understood as being needed more than ever, the sprawling co-curatorial model was, as curator Sahanya Rafael has noted, bursting at the seams. There were as many options about the direction and format of the exhibition as there were participants. In these circumstances, it seems timely to review the project's aims and purposes. With newly established curatorial positions for Asian and Pacific art, and drawing on a decade of research, exhibitions and collection building, the project had become fully institutionalised, and gallery staff took on all the curatorial work. The scope of the exhibition also narrowed significantly, featuring only 17 artists as opposed to over 70 in previous years, although each artist was represented by larger bodies of work. For the first time, the exhibition took a historical perspective, basing its structure around three influential avant-garde figures who all happen to be Asian: Yo-Yo Kusama, Nam June Paik and Liu Fan. Asian artists were now being positioned as international figures rather than just national or regional. Works by each artist from the 60s and 70s to the early 2000s were featured, along with works by other senior artists such as Ralph Hottery from New Zealand, Howard Taylor from Australia, Nalini Malani from India, and Montiam Bunma from Thailand. The exhibition focused on individual practices and established a kind of history of the contemporary to demonstrate the decades of artistic innovation that Asian and Pacific artists had been involved in, rather than just emerging out of nowhere in the 90s. Wu Hung contributed an essay to the catalogue on contemporaneity, mapping key developments as marked out by the selected artists, placing them within social and political contexts that are intertwined with a search for identity. Wu noted that numerous works of art focus on globalisation, a phenomenon that concerns not only geopolitics, but also histories, memories and identities. Cultural identity, which was always present and even criticised for being the main emphasis of the early triennials, began to be represented as a more complex and fluid proposition, such as considering diasporic artists working between cultures, as well as those working in interdisciplinary and collaborative ways. As Asian and Pacific artists became increasingly more mobile and their work more reflective in engagement with the international arena, this cosmopolitanism became less stated and more assumed aspect of the exhibition, and the aesthetic of the works in later triennials became increasingly what can be identified as global contemporary. The presentation of APT4 eschewed what many fondly recall as the chaotic, dense, somewhat raw displays of previous editions for a tightly installed classical museum exhibition. The aesthetic of the works was largely refined and formal, taking a canonical approach. Spaces were dedicated for mini-surveys or major displays by each artist. As AsiaLink founder Alison Carroll wrote in a review, it is a cast of stars, brightly shining individually in the night sky, nicely placed to be seen to advantage. In the past, APT has been more like the rush and the splash of the Milky Way, art and people and everything falling over themselves to fit, to be heard, to squeal and squawk and drum home their existence. The one project that broke out of this stately format was the raucous opening event by the queer Polynesian performance collective Pacifica Divas from New Zealand, which featured as part of Lisa Rehana's presentation. Body adornments and jewellery designed by Nikki Hastings-McFall and Sophia Tekela-Smith for the performances drew on traditional designs as well as contemporary styles, fashioned from everyday objects such as plastic soy sauce bottles, as well as mother of pearl and silver. But these were displayed in vitrines during the course of the exhibition, which reverted to conventional museum display. 2 years before, the building of the Gallery of Modern Art, or GOMA, had been announced, a new wing of the Queensland Art Gallery that would be the primary venue for future APT exhibitions. It was to be the largest contemporary art museum in Australia and was opened in December 2006 with APT5, which occupied the main spaces of both the new gallery and the Queensland Art Gallery building. A special budget was allocated by the state government for the opening, enabling the gallery to acquire almost 3/4 of the exhibition for the collection. Now spread across 2 buildings and with soaring galleries, a cinema and high-tech capabilities, the triennial took on a level of scale and spectacle that had not been possible prior. This institutional ambition was matched by the ability of now internationally established Asian artists, particularly from China and India, to occupy the capacious spaces with large-scale works. There was a large selection of sculptures by Ai Weiwei, including one of his signature chandeliers in the form of a boomerang. A section co-curated with the Long March project, featuring large-format photographs by Mu Chen and Xiao Yunong, and massive sculptures by Zhao Xiaohu and Wang Wenhai. There were sculptures and installations by Bharti Kaur, Jitish Kalat and Anish Kapoor, and a newly commissioned projection, The Farmers and the Helicopters by Ding Q Lei. Other video artists and filmmakers, including Yang Fudong and Apachatpong Wirasetiko, were featured in retrospectives in the Cinematheque as well as in gallery spaces throughout the building. Audience numbers went through the roof, more than tripling to over 750,000. In its polish and grand dimensions, the APT was now firmly positioned as an international rather than a regional blockbuster. Three months before the APT inaugurated GOMA, the Singapore Biennale was launched at the Old City Hall building, which the year before had been announced by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong as the site, along with the former Supreme Court, for the new National Gallery of Singapore, which was eventually to open 10 years later. A Singapore Biennale had been on the books for some years as part of the government's cultural policy, which was first outlined in 1989 in the report of the Advisory Council on Culture and the Arts, commissioned in the economic boom times of the 1980s. When it was decided that now the financial house was in order, Singapore was ready to address culture in a systematic way. The report trod a fine line between drawing on Western models while rejecting Western individualism. The country's economic success was attributed to was attributed to Asian values of collective responsibility, social order, and hard work. The report led to the establishment of the National Arts Council and the Singapore Art Museum in the 1990s, and was followed by the 2000 Renaissance City Report, which reviewed progress, as well as laying out a new 10-year plan that expanded its ambitions from the local to the global. Benchmarking against cities such as Glasgow and Melbourne, with Paris and London to follow in due course, the report recommended funding boosts to international promotion and exchange, scholarships and prizes, and to art education, stating as its aim, to establish Singapore as a global arts city. We want to position Singapore as a key city in the Asian Renaissance of the 21st century and a cultural centre in the globalised world. The idea is to be one of the top cities in the world to live, work and play in, where there is an environment conducive to creative and knowledge-based industries and talent. It clearly laid out the state position on art as a key agent of economic development and nation building. One of the recommendations in the 2000 report was to create a sculpture biennial, which never eventuated, but the projection of Singapore into the International Biennale system had already begun. The biennial Singapore Art Showcase exhibitions, which began in the 1990s, were devised as a platform for Singapore artists, with international curators invited strategically to attend. Hu Han-ru was a curator for the 1999 edition, and Okwi Enwezo was brought in to speak at the 2001 symposium, leading to the collective Tsunami.net, which include Charles Lim, to be invited into Documenta 11. Singapore Art Museum's then director, Kwok Yan Chow, was a key promoter of Singaporean art overseas, including acting as commissioner for Matthew Nui's presentation in the 1996 Sao Paulo Biennial, as well as Singapore's inaugural pavilion at Venice in 2001. In 2004, the national exhibition was provided an international counterpart, CENI Singapore, held in several venues across the city. The event was positioned as one of two biennials designed to boost Singapore's burgeoning art scene and to internationalise Singapore as a destination for visual arts events. CENI paves the way for the development of an international Singapore Biennale. The project featured primarily Southeast Asian artists with an emphasis on collective activity in an exhibition titled Home Fronts, Performance and New Media, as well as Performance and New Media, and it tested the capacity of the city to host an international visual arts event. It also, as art historian David Tay has noted, was indicative of how Singapore maps its place in the world, regionally, along the post-colonial lines of ASEAN, with a persistent focus on the notion of home. Unlike other countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore's identity is derived largely from migrant cultures, where home may also be an elsewhere, so it needs constant reaffirmation. The inaugural Biennale was part of a lineup of cultural events titled Singapore 2006, Global City, World of Opportunities, devised to accompany the International Monetary Fund and World Bank annual meetings held in Singapore that year, a clear indication of the state's positioning of culture in relation to global capital. The chairman's opening statement in the exhibition guide reiterated the intentions of the 2000 report, describing the Biennale as a culmination of the growth in visual arts in Singapore, underlining Singapore's position as an international visual arts hub, as well as a vibrant cosmopolitan city. It will not only provide new opportunities for Singapore artists, curators and arts businesses, but also facilitate exchange and collaborations for the global arts community. The exhibition was curated by experienced hand Fumio Nanjo as artistic director, with the assistance of younger curators Eugene Tan, who was to go on to head up the National Gallery, Shamini Pereira and Roger MacDonald. Under the theme of belief, the exhibition was located not only in the repurposed City Hall building, but also the old Tanglin military camp, several cultural institutions, and a selection of religious buildings around the city representing each of Singapore's major religions. Here we've got the Sri Krishnan Hindu temple with the work by N.S. Harsha, and Cha Wei Tsai showed at the Kwan Im Tong Hud Cho Chinese temple, as well as installations at the Masjid Sultan, 3 churches and a synagogue. In hosting international financial summits that in other cities had been marked by violent protest, Singapore, which had banned any demonstrations during the meetings, promoted social harmony by emphasising the country's racial and religious diversity and its carefully managed coexistence. The theme was explored in both literal and metaphorical ways. The event attracted significant international attention and was able to catch the art tourism crowd by timing its opening within a week of those of the Shanghai and Guangzhou Biennales. The exhibition featured a diverse lineup of artists, both such as Yao Kusama here on Orchard Road, the main shopping strip, and Jenny Holzer and Mariko Mori in the National Museum, as well as modest works by less well-known names from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. It used its many non-institutional sites creatively, with slightly political works by South African artist Jane Alexander and Singaporean filmmaker Ho Tzu Nyen occupying meeting rooms in the old City Hall building, which was the site of Lee Kuan Yew's inauguration and of his former offices. The exhibition established a pattern that continued with later editions, of occupying disused locations earmarked for urban development, such as Tanglin Camp, South Beach, Marina Bay, and the old Kallang Airport. So that's Agus Sawaji at Tanglin Camp, and this is Tanglin Camp now, a restaurant precinct. So this is the old City Hall, which is now the National Gallery. And then South Beach development was used for the second Biennale in 2008, which is now looks like that. So the dominant art forms were site-specific installation and video rather than the museum-friendly genres of painting and sculpture. This approach, of course, is not unique to Singapore. It had become a global trope of mega exhibitions. One thinks of the brewery and railway station used for previous editions of Documenta, as well as the Cockatoo Island site used for the Biennale of Sydney since 2008. These post-industrial buildings expand the mise-en-scène potential of the immersive art experience, emphasising physical encounter over digital mediation. They make for exciting locations layered with history and offer a wide scope for site-specific installation. But from experience with Kallang Airport, it also places major strains on the exhibition budget, as well as the visitors' capacity to endure the lack of air conditioning in tropical conditions. And this is the Achillesans and Shigeruban at the Marina Bay under development as well. This is the Kallang Airport site. The second Biennale in 2008, titled Wonder, was also headed by Fumio Nanjo, this time with Filipino curator Joselina Cruz and Singapore artist Matthew Nui. The emphasis in this exhibition was on beauty and immersive experience, featuring numerous installations with an emphasis on the sublime, and again featured a mix of Southeast Asian artists with international names such as the Kabakovs and Anthony McCall. It had a smaller budget than previously. It was the year of the crash. But it put more emphasis on public installations and education and outreach, aiming to broaden local visitation and engagement. It too was timed to link with several other biennales across the region and was cross-promoted through the Art Compass 2008 travel and media deal, which linked Guangzhou, Singapore, Yokohama, Sydney and Shanghai. The Biennale also featured an art fair in the basement of the City Hall building. No, that's not it. Which was the first, called Showcase Singapore, the first major international art fair to be held in the city, before ArtStage was launched in 2011. In that year, the third Biennale Open House opened and was the last to have an international remit. The Singapore Art Museum took on management of the Biennale from the National Arts Council and realigned the Biennale's approach to a regional one, with the fourth edition in 2013 exhibiting Southeast Asian artists only, with a couple of exceptions. The curatorial team included 27 curators from across the region, in a stated reference to the 1990s APT model. It was hosted almost entirely within museum venues, thus avoiding the use of transitional sites around the city and presenting a more institutional type of exhibition. This shift from an international to a regional model since the 2000s aligns with a growing state focus in Singapore on local concerns in cultural policy, using arts and culture to affirm a shared identity and Singapore spirit. Community engagement, audience development and heritage are the stated priorities for arts funding, and the projection into the world is now less about becoming an international cultural centre and more about making links for Singapore and Southeast Asia to international institutions and events, such as the recent long-term commitment to a permanent pavilion at Venice. Within the crowded global arena, this regional focus is offered up as distinctive and unique, setting the Singapore Biennale apart from what had come to be seen as a generic international exhibition model, with the next edition in October continuing its Southeast Asia content, with expansions into China and India. In Brisbane, this can also be seen perhaps in an increase in emphasis on Indigenous practices from Australia, the Pacific and India in the post-2000 triennials. The age of global exhibitions is not over, but a rejection of the expanded international format seems to be somewhat on the rise. The vast number of exhibitions abroad and shrinking funding at home now demands more specificity as well as closer engagement with local audiences, who are ultimately the majority of people who attend such exhibitions, not necessarily the floating citizens of the world that globalisation promised.